So now what we're going to do is we're going to cover public goods. And when I like to do this in class, I like to ask students what they think public goods are. When you imagine a public good, what are the ideas that come to mind? Because economics has a very precise definition of public goods. So let's get a list going as to what people's instincts are, and then we can define public goods, and then we can revisit these to see which ones are right and which ones are wrong. So I'm going to put a list right here of the ones I typically see. So this is the list I typically get. Something like this. I can't remember everything that usually comes up, but this is the kind of thing I usually see. Healthcare, education, roads, parks, housing, mass transit, defense. These are common things that the general public or the general people, not economists, tend to think of when they think of what a public good is. But of course, economists have a very precise definition. So let's talk about what that precise definition is, and then we'll see how many of these actually meet that criteria. So there are two important criteria in order for it to be a public good. In order for it to be a public good, it has to be something called non-excludable, which means it has to be impractical to prevent people from using the good without permission. Some goods are excludable. In fact, most goods are excludable. I have a laptop. I can prevent you from using that laptop because it's mine. I can hold on to it. And I can put an access code on it so you can get to it. I have a house. I have keys to the house. It is practical. It is cost effective to prevent people from using it. Well, something like radio waves, not the radio itself, but the radio waves. If you have a radio, you can turn on, you can turn to any station. And it is very hard to stop people from using it. North Korea does this. North Korea engineers its radio set itself so it can only pick up certain stations. But they have to constantly police people's homes and give them severe punishments if it turns out that they jiggered with their radio so that it could pick up someone that they shouldn't be. Right? It's a very costly thing to do. It's not really practical to do that because people still get away with it. Other goods that are non-excludable are access to certain fish. It's very hard to stop people from, say, harvesting tuna because you can't really own tuna, right? And that's one of the ways to think about non-excludability is impractical to establish property rights. Is impractical to establish property rights. Note, this is not about what is legal. Like, it is illegal maybe to exclude people. This is about what is economically practical. Public goods are not defined by laws, they're defined by economics. Non-rivalrous. So rivalry is a way to describe how consumers relate to one another when they use the good, right? Are consumers rivals or not? How much worse does the good become when you add another user? A good that is rivalrous means that if you want to have another person using that good, you have an additional cost. So if I want someone else to use my laptop, well, that doesn't work. So we have to then either I have to share it, which creates a cost for me, or you have to make a new laptop. For non-rivalrous goods, if you have an additional user, it doesn't make that good worse off in any way. Consumers are not rivals. When I turn on the radio, it doesn't lessen the radio signal for anyone else. It's exactly the same radio signal. When you use GPS to get directions, that doesn't interfere with anyone else's ability to use GPS. So with a non-rivalrous good, each additional user has does not interfere with existing users. Another way to think about that is the marginal cost of adding a user is zero. The marginal cost of adding a user is zero. In order for a good to be considered a public good in the economics sense, they have to be both of these things. The good has to be non-excludable. You can't stop people from using it in any practical sense. And the good has to be non-rivalrous, which means that the good isn't diminished at all when everyone uses it. You can see why we call them public goods, because this is kind of a good that you can't stop people from using, and because the cost of having someone use it is zero, you want everyone to use it. You want everyone to use this, and you couldn't stop them from doing it. Now, granted, both of these are spectrums. So while it is typically excludable, it does matter. That practicality part does matter on costs. So sometimes it is cost effective to exclude people when before it wasn't. Like, for example, for a long time, we consider like schools of tuna to be non-excludable because you can't really establish private property over them. The tuna roams all over the ocean. But with improvements in GPS, it looks like we might be able to tag entire schools of tuna and establish property rights and say that was my school of tuna that is swimming around. Non-rivalry is also a spectrum. Well, generally, yes, when in some cases, if you're using something, it doesn't make it worse off. But there are cases where there's congestion. So under normal circumstances, roads are non-rivalrous, right? If there's no one on the road and you get on the road that you can keep adding people, that doesn't interfere with your ability to enjoy the road. But when there's enough people on the road, then that car is in your way or that truck is in your way, and that makes you worse off. Right? You and this other consumer are now essentially competing over that same space. And so now all of a sudden the road becomes rivalrous. So when we think about public goods, we talk in terms of generalities. Right? Generally speaking, roads are non-rivalrous. Granted, they might not be, they're rivalrous during rush hour, but generally speaking, they're non-rivalrous. And the additional cost for an additional user is functionally zero. Similarly, the idea of what's excludable and what's not excludable, while that can change based on technology or rules of law and so forth, there are clear tendencies. But regardless, in order for it to be considered a public good, it has to be non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So let's go through this list. Is healthcare non-excludable? No, absolutely not. Healthcare is excludable all the time. It's very practical to exclude people from using healthcare. That's one of the concerns, is that people are excluded from healthcare. It's also rivalrous. It's a rivalrous good. When you are seeing a doctor, then someone else can't see the same doctor. You and another consumer compete with one another, right? It's not merely that there's congestion. There is this inherent scarcity of talent and space and equipment that prevent it from being a non-rivalrous good. So, healthcare, not a public good. Education, same story. It's very practical to exclude people from education, even though there might be a law that says everyone has to go you have to accept everyone to primary school. That's not about what the law is. It's about what is practical. It is about the economics. And it is, of course, possible to stop people from going to schools. Private schools do it all the time. Also, it's non-rivalrous, too. Also, it's rivalrous. The additional cost of adding a student is, I guarantee you, not zero. As a professor, while my costs might not change if there are more people in the class from the lecture standpoint, the grading really does mean the marginal cost of adding an additional student is not zero. It takes me more time to grade and to answer questions if there's a class of 30 than if there's a class of 10. Education, also not a public good. And note that these are the two things that people often think of when they think of public good. And there are other reasons why maybe we want to publicly fund them. But in an economic standpoint, they are fundamentally and cannot be considered public goods. Roads, though, possibly can be, right? It's very hard to exclude people from roads, at least when we talk about city roads. There are multiple entrant points to any particular road that you see in an urban area. So it's not like, what are you going to do, have a toll booth on every single road entrance? That's not practical. And like I said, most of the time it's non-rivalrous, right? You get on a road, and if there's no one on the road, you just go on your merry way. If there's someone that gets on the road, a block behind you or a block in front of you, that doesn't really change anything. You can pretty easily go around them. Granted, of course, there are times of congestion. And when there are times of congestion, that's when economists typically say, well, maybe we should start pricing it because now the marginal cost is not zero. But under ordinary circumstances, that's the case. Now, that said, there are sometimes roads like highways or interstates where they are excludable, where you could put toll booths because there are only so many entry and exit points. So roads, only city roads, they're public goods. Parks are kind of tricky, same sort of story, right? For like national parks, there's only a few entry points. And while most of the time they're not too crowded, sometimes they are, but generally there's only a few entry points, so they're certainly excludable. But, again, if we're talking city parks where there's lots of ways to get in, then it's kind of impractical to stop people. And just because one kid is playing in the park doesn't interfere with anyone else's ability to play in the park. In fact, sometimes that's kind of nice because they have someone to play with. It doesn't strike me, at least not inherently, as non-rivalrous. At least not as doesn't strike me as inherently rivalrous. So parks, this is a good argument that parks are public goods. Housing, though, certainly is not a public good. If you want to have an additional person that's living somewhere, you're going to have them, have an additional space. So there's a cost, right? It's non-rivalrous to add an additional person. Or if they're going to live with someone, that's certainly not costless to have roommates, to have someone else in your space, to have someone else who you have to work with and live with. And there's certainly excludable. Housing is certainly excludable, right? That's one of the complaints, is that people get kicked out. So however you feel about housing, it is not a public good. Mass transit is interesting because often you can consider it non-rivalrous. You add one more person. Maybe it's a little unpleasant for them to be there, so you can argue there's a little bit of rivalry. It depends, again, on congestion. But it's certainly excludable. It's certainly excludable. Right? Mass transit certainly is. People get on, there's a turnstile, there's a few entry points. You can certainly stop people from using it. National defense. So when one additional baby is born, like that is someone who is in a country, that is someone who is benefiting from national defense. But the cost of national defense do not go up. Right? No one says, oh, you shouldn't have that kid born because then that's going to be harder for the National Guard to help, or for the military to help protect us against like invading Canadians. Right? No one thinks that. So for good reason, right? It's non-rivalrous. And it's certainly non-excludable, too. You can't have a situation where the U.S. military is only going to prevent, everyone's house except Justin's house. Right? And people can invade Justin's house, but not like the pieces around it. Doesn't, If you're protecting an area against invasion, you're protecting everyone within that area. And you can't really get around that. So national defense is actually a public good, right? It is non-excludable. You can't exclude people from benefiting from it, and it's non-rivalrous. The additional user does not create any additional costs on the margin. So note that most things people think about public goods are not actually public goods. And if you think of something else you think is a public good, well, you can check. Is it non-excludable? Is it non-rivalrous? Now, economists typically say that if it's a public good, it has to be provided by the government. Because it's non-rivalrous, we want everyone to use it. And because it's non-excludable, then you can very easily get something called a free rider. People who enjoy the benefit of the good without paying for it. So the only way to get everyone to pay for it is if you force them to pay for it. And that means taxes. This is a bit of a controversial point within economics, but generally speaking, for a lot of public goods, economists say, look, we need national defense. If we didn't have taxes and funding national defense through the government, then people would essentially free ride off the benefit of others, and then we would not have sufficient national defense. This is actually what happened in the early days of the 13 colonies of the United States. When it was first started out, they made the central government very, very weak under the Articles of Confederation. And one of the ways it was weak was the central government had a very hard time collecting taxes, and it could not tax the colonies. Essentially, these young states had to more or less contribute voluntarily to the central government. And because of that, they didn't have sufficient money for defense, and so they had to write a stronger government and had to write a constitution. That said, it's a little controversial because there are things that are public goods that are not government sponsored. A lot of art, murals, for example, those are public goods. If you look at a mural, you can see it. And when someone else is looking at it, that doesn't interfere with your ability to enjoy it. And you can't really stop people from seeing a mural. You can't, what are you going to do? Make like a building around it? That defeats the purpose. A lot of radio stations, right? Radio waves are public goods, but you don't need to have some government subsidizing them. Advertising can make up a lot of this. Advertising can fix this problem essentially by turning the fact that everyone can enjoy it very easily from a cost into a benefit. The non-excludability is like, well, you don't want to exclude people. You want everyone to use it. So markets can solve some of these public good problems on their own, but it's still very hard to imagine like a national defense, given how very expensive national defense is, to work with a completely voluntary contribution. Even roads are very expensive to maintain, and certain parks, well, sometimes there are private parks, and they might not be enough. We can take this idea of public goods and we can then put them in their proper place by creating a 2x2 matrix, because we have, as mentioned, excludable and non-excludable goods, rivalrous and non-rivalrous goods. So we have this 2x2 matrix. Non-rivalrous, non-excludable, as we mentioned, are public goods. The opposite are what we would consider most goods, whether that's playing cards or computers or trash cans or potatoes or princess dolls. These are private goods. Most goods are private goods. What we're going to be talking about in the next video are non-rivalrous excludable goods, called club goods, where an additional user has a cost of 0, but you can stop people from using it. And rivalrous non-excludable goods, which we call commons, where you can't stop people from using it, but each additional user creates a cost on others.